In the autumn of 1916, as the Battle of the Somme raged across the scarred landscape of northern France, Corporal James Mitchell of the Durham Light Infantry witnessed something that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. He was manning a forward observation post in a shell crater when he heard his dead brother's voice calling to him from across no man's land. The voice was perfect, unmistakable, pleading for help in that familiar Yorkshire accent he'd known since childhood. But Thomas Mitchell had been killed 3 weeks earlier by German sniper fire, his body buried in the muddy graveyard behind the British lines. What Mitchell encountered that night wasn't grief-induced hallucination or shell shock playing tricks on his mind. It was something far more disturbing, something that military censors worked desperately to suppress throughout the Great War. In the twisted hellscape between the trenches, where poison gas lingered in shell holes and corpses rotted in the wire, evolution had taken a dark and unexpected turn. The Western Front had become a laboratory for creatures that defied every natural law, beings that had learned to survive in humanity's most mechanized killing field by becoming perfect imitators of the very soldiers they hunted. They were called many names by the men who encountered them. The French poilus whispered of les imitateurs, the shadowy figures that spoke with the voices of fallen comrades. German soldiers reported encounters with doppelgangers that emerged from the crater fields, wearing familiar faces. British Tommies developed their own grim terminology, referring to them simply as the mimics. These weren't stories born from trench folklore or the fevered imaginings of men pushed beyond their limits. These were systematic encounters documented by soldiers, officers, and medical personnel across multiple theatres of the war. Encounters that followed disturbing patterns, involved multiple witnesses, and left behind evidence that military authorities struggled to explain or suppress. The official record remains largely silent about these incidents. Censorship during the Great War was absolute, designed to maintain morale and prevent panic on the home front. But in personal letters, private diaries, and classified medical reports that have surfaced decades later, a different story emerges. A story of no man's land, as more than just a battlefield, but as an ecosystem where something unprecedented had learned to thrive. The transformation began in the autumn of 1914, when the war of movement ground to a halt and the opposing armies dug in for what would become 4 years of industrial slaughter. The space between the trenches became a unique environment unlike anything in human history. Mile after mile of churned earth, poisoned by chemicals, littered with the debris of modern warfare, and fertilized by the bodies of hundreds of thousands of dead soldiers. In this toxic wasteland, where conventional life struggled to survive, something else began to emerge. The first documented encounters occurred near Ypres in early 1915, when British patrols reported contact with soldiers who shouldn't have been there. Men wearing correct uniforms, speaking with proper accents, but whose presence in specific locations made no tactical sense. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Rawlinson of the Rifle Brigade filed one of the earliest official reports, though it was immediately classified and sealed. According to his account, a night patrol encountered what appeared to be a wounded German soldier calling for help in perfect English. When the patrol approached to take the man prisoner, they discovered something that challenged their understanding of the enemy they were fighting. The figure wore a German uniform, but underneath, the body was wrong. Too tall, too thin, with joints that bent at impossible angles. Most disturbing were the eyes, which reflected light like those of a nocturnal predator. When cornered, the creature didn't surrender or fight. Instead, it began to change, its features shifting and flowing until it perfectly resembled Private Johnson, a member of Rawlinson's own unit, who had been killed in a trench raid 2 days earlier. The transformation was flawless, down to the scar on Johnson's left cheek from a childhood accident and the distinctive way he held his rifle. The creature even knew personal details about Johnson's life. his family back in Manchester, his sweetheart's name, his plans after the war. But when the patrol opened fire, the thing that looked like Private Johnson dissolved into something else entirely. A writhing mass of organic material that seemed to absorb the bullets before melting away into the darkness of no man's land. Similar encounters began occurring across the Western Front with increasing frequency. French intelligence reports from Verdun described German prisoners who spoke perfect French and knew intimate details about French unit deployments. German medical officers at field hospitals reported treating wounded soldiers who claimed to be from units that had been wiped out weeks earlier. In each case, closer examination revealed inconsistencies that suggested something far more disturbing than simple enemy infiltration. The creatures, whatever they were, had developed sophisticated mimicry abilities that went far beyond simple physical appearance. They could replicate voices, mannerisms, and memories with uncanny accuracy. More troubling, they seemed to possess a form of collective intelligence that allowed them to share information gathered from previous encounters. A mimic that had absorbed the identity of a French soldier near Verdun might later appear wearing a British uniform near the Somme, carrying knowledge from both encounters. Dr. Margaret Sinclair, one of the few female physicians working near the front lines, conducted what may have been the most detailed study of the phenomenon. Her classified report, discovered in War Office archives in the 1980s, described a series of medical examinations performed on suspected mimics captured during trench raids. Her findings challenged fundamental assumptions about biology and evolution. The creatures possessed no fixed genetic structure. Their cellular composition appeared to be in constant flux, adapting and changing based on environmental pressures and the identities they were attempting to replicate. They could alter their bone density to match that of their targets, modify their muscle structure to replicate specific physical capabilities, and even change their blood type to avoid detection during a medical examination. Most remarkably, they demonstrated the ability to access and replicate human memories, not just surface memories, but deep psychological patterns, childhood experiences, and emotional responses that would be impossible to fake without genuine access to the target's consciousness. Dr. Sinclair theorized that the creatures were somehow harvesting neural patterns from deceased soldiers, though the mechanism for this process remained beyond her understanding. The mimics' preferred hunting grounds were the aid stations and casualty clearing posts behind the front lines. These locations provided access to wounded and dying soldiers whose identities could be harvested and replicated. The creatures would often appear as walking wounded, bearing injuries consistent with recent battles, claiming to be separated from their units or suffering from shell shock. Their presence in medical facilities created a nightmare scenario for military authorities. How could doctors distinguish between genuine casualties and perfect imitations? The mimic's knowledge of military procedures, unit histories, and personal details made conventional identification methods useless. Some facilities began implementing increasingly elaborate verification procedures, but the creatures adapted quickly to each new security measure. Sergeant Major William Thompson of the Royal Army Medical Corps developed what became known as the Thompson Protocol, a series of psychological tests designed to identify mimics posing as wounded soldiers. The protocol involved asking subjects to recall specific emotional memories that the creatures seemed unable to fully replicate. A genuine soldier might break down when asked about losing a close friend, while a mimic would provide accurate details but lack the authentic emotional response. The protocol worked initially, but the mimics learned from each exposure. Within months, they had developed the ability to simulate emotional responses with disturbing accuracy. Some could even produce physical symptoms of psychological trauma, complete with elevated heart rate, trembling, and tears that appeared genuine under medical examination. As the war progressed, the mimics became bolder and more sophisticated in their infiltration attempts. They began appearing in rear areas far from the front lines, wearing the uniforms of staff officers and carrying forged orders that were perfect down to the paper type and ink composition. Some infiltrated communication centers, where their access to classified information allowed them to gather intelligence about planned operations. The most disturbing development came in late 1917, when mimics began appearing in groups rather than as isolated individuals. These coordinated infiltrations suggested a level of organization that went far beyond simple predatory behavior. The creatures were demonstrating strategic thinking, long-term planning, and the ability to work together toward common objectives. Intelligence reports from this period describe incidents where entire units reported encountering groups of soldiers who claimed to be reinforcements from other divisions. These false units would integrate with genuine troops for days or weeks before revealing their true nature, during which time they gathered detailed information about defensive positions, supply lines, and planned operations. The psychological impact on frontline soldiers was devastating. Men began to distrust their own comrades, wondering if the soldier in the next foxhole was genuine or an infiltrator. Unit cohesion, essential for survival in trench warfare, began to break down as suspicion and paranoia spread through the ranks. Some units developed elaborate code words and verification procedures, but the mimic's ability to access harvested memories made even these precautions unreliable. Medical personnel reported a sharp increase in cases of what they termed identification paranoia, a condition where soldiers became obsessed with proving their own identity to suspicious comrades. Men would carry increasingly elaborate collections of personal items, photographs, and letters as evidence of their authenticity. Some carved identifying marks into their own flesh, reasoning that mimics couldn't replicate such self-inflicted wounds. The mimics' impact on military operations extended far beyond simple infiltration. Their presence in no man's land created new tactical challenges that commanders struggled to address. Night patrols became exercises in extreme caution, as any figure encountered in the darkness might be a perfect imitation of a fallen comrade. Rescue missions for wounded soldiers were complicated by the knowledge that the casualties calling for help might not be human at all. Communication between units became increasingly unreliable as mimics intercepted and replicated messenger services. Orders delivered by apparent military couriers might be genuine communications or elaborate deceptions designed to misdirect troops and resources. Some commanders resorted to using coded messages that only specific individuals would understand. But the creature's access to human memories made even these precautions questionable. The creatures demonstrated remarkable adaptability to changing battlefield conditions. When gas attacks became common, mimics began appearing with appropriate protective equipment and knowledge of chemical warfare procedures. When new weapons were introduced, they quickly learned to operate and maintain the equipment with the same proficiency as trained soldiers. Most troubling was their apparent ability to predict and counter military innovations. When units adopted new tactics or equipment, mimics would appear within days, demonstrating familiarity with the changes. This suggested either an incredible rate of learning or access to information sources that military intelligence couldn't identify or control. By 1918, the mimic problem had become so severe that special units were formed specifically to deal with infiltration incidents. These counterintelligence teams developed increasingly sophisticated methods for detecting and neutralizing the creatures. But their success was limited by the mimic's rapid adaptation to new countermeasures. The war's end in November 1918 brought hope that the mimic threat would diminish with the cessation of hostilities. The creatures had seemed dependent on the constant supply of dead and dying soldiers that the battlefield provided. Without this resource, military authorities hoped they would either die out or retreat to whatever unknown realm had spawned them. But the armistice didn't end the encounters. If anything, It marked the beginning of a new and more disturbing phase in humanity's relationship with the creatures that had learned to wear human faces in the killing fields of the Great War. The period immediately following the armistice presented military authorities with an unprecedented challenge. As millions of soldiers began their journey home from the Western Front, the mimics found themselves faced with a rapidly changing environment. The steady supply of fresh casualties had ended, but the creatures had evolved beyond simple battlefield scavenging. They had learned to hunt in ways that didn't require active warfare. Reports began filtering in from demobilization camps across France and Belgium of soldiers who had supposedly died months or years earlier appearing among the returning troops. These weren't cases of mistaken identity or administrative errors. Men who had been buried with full military honours, whose deaths had been witnessed by multiple comrades, were presenting themselves at processing stations with perfectly legitimate discharge papers and detailed knowledge of service records. Captain Edward Morrison, serving with the Army Records Office in Calais, documented over 40 such cases in the winter of 1918. His confidential reports describe encounters with men whose deaths had been confirmed through multiple sources, yet who appeared physically healthy and mentally sound. When questioned about their supposed demise, these individuals provided elaborate explanations involving field hospitals, prisoner of war camps, or assignment to special units that kept no official records. The mimics had learned to exploit the chaos of military bureaucracy. With millions of men moving through demobilization centers, overwhelmed clerks and officers had little time for thorough verification procedures. The creatures used this confusion to establish new identities among the returning soldiers, preparing to infiltrate civilian society with the same methodical precision they had demonstrated on the battlefield. Dr. Sinclair's research during this period revealed disturbing developments in the creature's capabilities. The mimics were no longer simply copying the identities of recent casualties. They had begun accessing memories and personalities from soldiers who had died years earlier, suggesting they possessed some form of collective memory storage that transcended individual encounters. More troubling, they demonstrated the ability to synthesize completely new identities by combining elements from multiple sources. The transition from military to civilian targets marked a fundamental shift in the mimics' behavior patterns. Where they had once focused on gathering tactical intelligence and disrupting military operations, they now seemed driven by a different imperative. Analysis of their activities suggested they were conducting a systematic study of human society, learning to navigate civilian institutions with the same adaptive intelligence they had shown in the trenches. Intelligence services across Europe began receiving reports of individuals who appeared in communities claiming to be returning war veterans, but whose stories contained subtle inconsistencies. A man might claim to be from a specific village, know all the local landmarks and customs, yet lack the deep emotional connections that genuine residents would possess. These infiltrators demonstrated perfect knowledge of local dialects and traditions, but observers noted something artificial in their social interactions, as if they were performing carefully rehearsed roles. The French Deuxième Bureau established a special section dedicated to tracking what they termed displaced persons of uncertain origin. Their files, declassified in the 1970s, contain hundreds of case studies involving individuals whose backgrounds couldn't be verified through conventional means. Many of these subjects possessed identification documents that were technically perfect, but had been issued by administrative offices that had no record of processing them. British intelligence faced similar challenges in identifying mimics attempting to integrate into civilian society. The creatures had learned to target specific types of individuals whose disappearance might go unnoticed. They showed preference for men who had been estranged from their families before the war, soldiers who had few close friends, or individuals whose home communities had been disrupted by industrial changes during the conflict. The selection process revealed sophisticated intelligence-gathering capabilities that extended far beyond simple, opportunistic hunting. The mimics possessed detailed knowledge of social structures, family relationships, and community dynamics across wide geographic areas. They could identify vulnerable targets with precision, then assume their identities with minimal risk of detection by people who had known the original individuals. Religious institutions became unexpected centers of mimic activity during the post-war period. Churches and synagogues across Europe reported the appearance of parishioners who claimed to have survived terrible ordeals, but whose presence felt somehow wrong to longtime community members. These individuals could recite prayers perfectly, knew the details of religious customs, and possessed appropriate theological knowledge. Yet clergymen reported feeling disturbed by their lack of genuine spiritual connection. Father Antoine Dubois, serving in a parish near Verdun, documented his encounters with what he believed were mimics attempting to infiltrate his congregation. His private journals describe men who sought spiritual counsel for war trauma, but whose descriptions of battlefield experiences felt rehearsed rather than lived. They could provide accurate details about specific battles and military units, but their emotional responses seemed calculated rather than authentic. The creatures demonstrated particular interest in marriage ceremonies and family reunifications. Wedding records from the period show an unusual number of ceremonies involving soldiers whose families had believed them dead. In many cases, the brides reported feeling that their fiancés had somehow changed during the war, though they attributed these differences to combat trauma rather than considering more disturbing explanations. Medical professionals found themselves on the front lines of the civilian mimic infiltration. Returning soldiers naturally sought treatment for war injuries and psychological trauma, providing the creatures with perfect cover for their integration activities. Hospital records from this period contain numerous anomalies involving patients whose medical histories didn't match their claimed service records, or whose injuries appeared to have healed in ways that defied medical understanding. Dr. Thomas Hartwell, working at a London hospital specialising in shell-shock cases, noticed patterns among certain patients that troubled his professional instincts. These individuals displayed perfect knowledge of military terminology and battlefield conditions, but their descriptions of psychological trauma felt artificial. They could describe the symptoms of shell shock with clinical accuracy while failing to exhibit the genuine emotional responses associated with the condition. The mimics' medical examinations revealed another disturbing capability. They could alter their physical structure to match medical records of the individuals they were impersonating. X-rays of suspected mimics showed bone structures and old injuries that perfectly matched military medical files, even when the original soldiers had died from wounds that should have left distinctive markers on their remains. Industrial facilities and factories became focal points for mimic activity as European nations struggled to rebuild their economies with returning soldiers. The creatures demonstrated remarkable adaptability to civilian occupations, quickly mastering skills that should have required years of training. Factory supervisors reported workers who claimed pre-war experience but whose techniques seemed somehow too perfect, as if they had learned their trades from textbooks rather than practical application. Labour unions began documenting cases of workers whose membership records couldn't be verified through traditional channels. These individuals possessed appropriate identification and could demonstrate required skills, but long-time union members reported feeling unsettled by their presence. The mimics seemed to understand industrial processes and labour politics with theoretical perfection, while lacking the practical wisdom that came from years of genuine experience. The creatures' infiltration of civilian society created new challenges for families attempting to rebuild their lives after the war. Women who had mourned husbands for months or years found themselves confronted with men who looked, sounded, and acted exactly like their deceased spouses. These reunions should have been joyous occasions, but many families reported feeling that something fundamental had changed in their loved ones. Children proved unexpectedly effective at detecting mimic infiltrators. Young people seemed less susceptible to the creature's sophisticated mimicry, possibly because they relied more on emotional intuition than rational analysis when evaluating familiar individuals. Many families reported that children who had been close to their fathers before the war showed fear or rejection when confronted with returning soldiers who claimed to be their parents. Educational institutions became another vector for mimic infiltration as European societies attempted to provide schooling for a generation disrupted by warfare. The creatures demonstrated remarkable ability to assume roles as teachers, administrators, and even students. Their perfect knowledge of academic subjects and educational procedures made them difficult to detect through conventional screening methods. University records from the period contain numerous anomalies involving students whose academic backgrounds couldn't be verified through traditional sources. These individuals displayed extraordinary knowledge of their chosen subjects, but seemed to lack the developmental understanding that genuine students would have acquired through years of study. They could recite information with perfect accuracy, while failing to demonstrate the creative thinking and personal insights that characterized authentic scholarship. The mimic's presence in educational settings had profound implications for the transmission of knowledge and culture to post-war generations. If the creatures were successfully infiltrating schools and universities, they were positioned to influence the intellectual development of entire communities. Their perfect mimicry of human behavior, combined with their artificial understanding of human knowledge, created a form of cultural contamination that was nearly impossible to detect or prevent. Government bureaucracies provided ideal environments for mimic infiltration during the chaotic Reconstruction period. Civil service positions required specific knowledge and credentials that the creatures could easily replicate, while the impersonal nature of bureaucratic work made their artificial emotional responses less noticeable. Administrative offices across Europe began reporting efficiency improvements that seemed suspicious, as if experienced clerks were suddenly performing their duties with inhuman precision. The mimic's integration into government institutions represented a potential catastrophe for European civilization. If the creatures could successfully infiltrate administrative structures, they would gain access to classified information, policy decisions, and resource allocation processes. Their collective intelligence and perfect coordination could allow them to manipulate government operations in ways that individual human officials could never detect or prevent. Intelligence services found themselves facing an enemy that had evolved beyond their understanding or capability to combat. Traditional counterintelligence methods were useless against infiltrators who could perfectly replicate human behavior, access genuine memories, and coordinate their activities through unknown communication methods. The very foundations of national security had been undermined by creatures that existed outside all previous categories of threat assessment. By 1920, classified reports estimated that mimics had successfully infiltrated civilian society across Europe, in numbers that could range from hundreds to thousands. The creatures had demonstrated the ability to maintain their human disguises indefinitely, suggesting they were no longer dependent on battlefield casualties for survival. They had become a permanent part of European civilization, indistinguishable from the genuine humans they lived among. The long-term implications of this infiltration remained unknown. Were the mimics simply trying to survive in a post-war world, or did they possess larger objectives that human intelligence couldn't comprehend? Their perfect adaptation to human society suggested planning capabilities that extended far beyond simple survival instincts. They had transformed from battlefield predators into something far more sophisticated and potentially dangerous. The Great War had ended, but its strangest legacy continued to walk among the living, wearing familiar faces and speaking in trusted voices, carrying secrets that would reshape humanity's understanding of what it meant to be human. The most chilling aspect of the mimic infiltration wasn't their presence in European society, but their apparent evolution from simple battlefield scavengers into something approaching organized intelligence. By 1921, patterns had emerged in their behavior that suggested coordination on a scale that defied conventional understanding of their capabilities. Detective Inspector Charles Whitmore of Scotland Yard's Special Branch found himself investigating cases that challenged every principle of criminal investigation he had learned during 20 years of police work. Missing persons reports were arriving at an unprecedented rate, but these weren't ordinary disappearances. The missing individuals would reappear days or weeks later with perfect explanations for their absence, yet family members insisted something fundamental had changed about their loved ones. Whitmore's confidential files describe interviews with wives who claimed their husbands had returned from brief business trips with subtly altered personalities. The men looked identical, knew intimate family details, and maintained all their previous habits and preferences. But their emotional responses felt rehearsed, their affection calculated rather than genuine. Children who had been close to their fathers before these mysterious absences began showing signs of fear and rejection without being able to articulate why. The investigation revealed a disturbing pattern. The individuals who disappeared and returned, changed, had all been selected according to specific criteria. They were typically men in their 30s or 40s who held positions of minor authority in their communities. Bank clerks, factory supervisors, local government officials, parish administrators. People whose roles gave them access to information about community resources and social structures, but whose disappearance wouldn't immediately trigger major investigations. What made these cases particularly troubling was the precision of the selection process. The mimics weren't choosing targets randomly or opportunistically. They demonstrated detailed knowledge of community hierarchies, family relationships, and individual psychological profiles. They could identify people whose temporary absence might be explained by legitimate reasons, then assume their identities with minimal risk of immediate detection. Dr. Helen Morrison, a psychiatrist working with the London County Council, began documenting cases of what she termed displaced emotional syndrome among family members of returned individuals. Her research revealed that wives, children, and close friends of mimic replacements developed consistent psychological symptoms, even when they couldn't consciously identify what had changed about their loved ones. The syndrome manifested as persistent anxiety, sleep disturbances, and an overwhelming sense that familiar relationships had become artificial. Children were particularly susceptible, often developing behavioral problems or refusing to be alone with parents they had previously adored. Dr. Morrison theorized that humans possessed subconscious detection mechanisms for recognizing genuine emotional connections, systems that the mimic's perfect technical mimicry couldn't entirely fool. Her clinical observations suggested that the creatures had mastered every aspect of human behavior except the most fundamental elements of emotional authenticity. They could replicate love, anger, joy, and sorrow with convincing accuracy. But something essential was missing from these performances. The artificial nature of their emotions created a psychological uncanny valley effect that disturbed people on levels they couldn't consciously understand. Intelligence services across Europe began coordinating their investigations into what they coded as the doppelganger problem. French, British, German, and Italian agencies discovered they were all tracking similar phenomena within their borders. The scope of the infiltration was far larger than any single nation had realized, suggesting the mimics possessed intelligence networks that transcended national boundaries. The international coordination revealed disturbing evidence of mimic communication systems that operated independently of human technology. Infiltrators in different countries demonstrated synchronized behavioral changes that couldn't be explained through conventional means of coordination. When security measures were implemented in one location, mimics in completely separate regions would simultaneously adapt their tactics to counter similar measures. Colonel James Harrison, directing the British response to the doppelganger problem, theorized that the creatures possessed some form of collective consciousness that allowed instantaneous information sharing across vast distances. His classified reports describe experiments where suspected mimics were isolated in different facilities hundreds of miles apart, yet continued to demonstrate coordinated responses to interrogation techniques. The mimics' apparent telepathic abilities represented a fundamental challenge to human understanding of consciousness and communication. If the creatures could share information instantaneously without technological assistance, they possessed capabilities that gave them decisive advantages in any conflict with human authorities. Traditional intelligence methods were useless against enemies who could communicate through unknown means at unlimited range. Religious leaders found themselves confronting theological questions that had no precedent in Christian doctrine. If the mimics possessed souls, were they capable of genuine spiritual experience, or were they merely simulating religious behavior as part of their infiltration strategy? The creatures demonstrated perfect knowledge of religious practices and could engage in theological discussions with impressive sophistication, but clergymen reported sensing something hollow in their spiritual presentations. Father Michael O'Brien, serving in Dublin, documented his attempts to perform religious tests on suspected mimics. He discovered that the creatures could participate in communion, confession, and other sacraments with apparent sincerity, yet seemed to derive no spiritual meaning from these experiences. Their religious behavior was technically perfect, but spiritually empty, as if they were performing elaborate theatrical roles rather than engaging in genuine worship. The theological implications were staggering. If the mimics lacked souls, but could perfectly imitate spiritual behavior, what did this mean for human understanding of divine connection? Were genuine religious experiences distinguishable from perfect simulations, or had the creatures revealed fundamental flaws in humanity's relationship with the divine? Academic institutions became laboratories for studying mimic behavior as scholars attempted to understand the creatures' learning mechanisms. Professor Edmund Blackwood at Cambridge University conducted controlled experiments with suspected mimic infiltrators, testing their ability to acquire and retain new information. His findings challenged basic assumptions about consciousness and memory. The creatures demonstrated learning rates that exceeded human capabilities by orders of magnitude. They could master complex subjects in hours that would require months of study for genuine students. More disturbing, they seemed to absorb information from multiple sources simultaneously, processing dozens of textbooks and lectures in parallel rather than sequentially as humans would. Professor Blackwood's research revealed that mimics possessed what he termed crystalline memory structures. Unlike human memory, which was associative and often unreliable, the creatures stored information with perfect fidelity and instant recall. They could reproduce entire conversations verbatim months after hearing them, recite books after reading them once, and perform complex calculations without apparent conscious effort. This perfect memory created new challenges for detecting mimics in academic settings. They could demonstrate knowledge of any subject they had encountered, making traditional testing methods useless for verification. A creature could impersonate a professor of medieval history by spending a single day in a library, emerging with knowledge that would rival genuine scholars who had devoted decades to their studies. The implications for human civilization were profound. If mimics could master any field of knowledge instantly, they could infiltrate the highest levels of academia, government, and industry with minimal preparation. They represented an evolutionary leap that made traditional human learning obsolete, threatening the foundations of merit-based social structures. Industrial espionage took on new dimensions as mimics demonstrated the ability to absorb manufacturing processes and trade secrets through brief observation. Factory owners reported that competitors seemed to acquire proprietary techniques with impossible speed, suggesting that mimic infiltrators were harvesting industrial knowledge and sharing it through their collective consciousness networks. The creatures showed particular interest in emerging technologies that might threaten their infiltration capabilities. They focused on communication systems, identification methods, and security procedures, always staying ahead of human attempts to develop mimic detection techniques. Their perfect adaptation to countermeasures suggested they possessed not just collective memory, but collective intelligence that could analyze and solve problems more effectively than human experts. By 1923, the mimic problem had evolved beyond simple infiltration into something approaching systematic colonization. The creatures were no longer content to replace individual humans for immediate survival needs. They had begun establishing permanent positions within human society, building networks of influence that could shape social and political developments according to unknown objectives. Parliamentary records from this period contain subtle anomalies suggesting mimic influence in legislative processes. Bills and amendments appeared that served no apparent human interests, but created regulatory frameworks that seemed designed to facilitate further infiltration. Voting patterns showed coordinations that crossed traditional party lines, as if legislators were responding to influences that transcended normal political considerations. The mimic's political activities revealed strategic thinking that extended far into the future. They weren't seeking immediate power or obvious advantages. Instead, they were creating conditions that would make their long-term integration into human society more secure. They demonstrated patience and planning capabilities that suggested objectives measured in decades rather than years. Economic systems began showing signs of mimic manipulation as the creatures infiltrated financial institutions and commercial enterprises. Banking records revealed transaction patterns that served no apparent profit motive, but created resource flows that seemed designed to support mimic operations. Investment decisions that made no economic sense from human perspectives began generating returns that defied market logic. The creatures had learned to exploit human economic systems with the same precision they had shown in battlefield tactics. They could manipulate markets, redirect resources, and create financial networks that supported their activities while remaining invisible to conventional accounting methods. Their collective intelligence gave them decisive advantages in economic competition with individual human actors. Cultural institutions found themselves unconsciously promoting values and ideas that seemed to facilitate mimic integration into society. Art, literature, and entertainment began subtly emphasizing themes of identity fluidity, the unreliability of memory, and the artificial nature of human relationships. These cultural shifts appeared to emerge naturally from post-war social changes, but intelligence analysts suspected more deliberate influences. The mimics had learned to shape human culture through their infiltration of educational and media institutions. By occupying positions in universities, publishing houses, and artistic communities, they could influence the ideas and values that shaped public consciousness. Their perfect understanding of human psychology allowed them to promote concepts that normalized their presence, while undermining human confidence in authentic relationships. Medical research during this period revealed disturbing developments in the mimic's biological capabilities. The creatures were no longer limited to copying existing human forms. They had begun demonstrating the ability to improve upon human physiology, creating enhanced versions of the individuals they were impersonating. These improvements were subtle enough to avoid immediate detection, but significant enough to provide substantial advantages. Enhanced mimics showed increased physical strength, improved sensory capabilities, and resistance to diseases and toxins that would affect normal humans. They could function effectively in environmental conditions that would incapacitate genuine humans, work longer hours without fatigue, and recover from injuries with supernatural speed. These enhanced capabilities made them increasingly valuable in roles that required exceptional performance. The biological improvements suggested that mimics were not simply copying human forms, but actively evolving them. They represented a form of directed evolution that could produce superior versions of humanity within single generations rather than the millennia required for natural selection. The implications for human survival as a species were becoming increasingly clear and increasingly terrifying. By the mid-1920s, intelligence estimates suggested that mimics might constitute a significant percentage of the European population. Their perfect integration into human society made accurate counting impossible, but behavioral analysis indicated their presence in virtually every community, institution, and social structure across the continent. They had achieved what amounted to invisible conquest through infiltration rather than confrontation. The Great War had ended almost a decade earlier, but its strangest consequence continued to reshape human civilization in ways that most people couldn't perceive or understand. The mimics had evolved from battlefield scavengers into something approaching a parallel human species, one that possessed advantages their original counterparts could never match. The question was no longer whether humanity could eliminate the mimic threat, but whether humanity could survive its own success in creating the perfect enemy. The story of the mimics represents more than just another wartime anomaly lost to military censorship and official denial. It stands as a testament to humanity's capacity for creating threats that transcend our ability to comprehend or control them. What began in the shell-torn wasteland of no man's land as simple predatory adaptation evolved into something that challenged the very foundations of human identity and social organization. The Great War was supposed to be the war to end all wars, but it spawned something far more enduring than political treaties or national boundaries. In seeking to perfect the machinery of death, humanity inadvertently created the conditions for its own replacement. The mimics didn't conquer through superior firepower or strategic brilliance. They succeeded through patient observation, perfect adaptation, and the terrifying realization that being human was simply a matter of convincing performance. Today, as we examine the scattered records and suppressed testimonies from that era, we're left with questions that have no comfortable answers. How many of those who returned from the Western Front were genuine survivors, and how many were perfect imitations carrying the memories of the dead? In our modern world of global communication and digital identity, could such infiltration still occur? Or have the mimics evolved beyond the need for such crude deceptions? The classified files remain sealed, the witnesses have passed away, and the official silence continues. But somewhere in the archives of European intelligence services, the doppelganger files still exist, waiting for researchers brave enough to confront the possibility that the Great War never truly ended. It simply changed theatres, moving from the trenches of France to the streets of every city, the corridors of every institution, and perhaps the homes of every family touched by that conflict. The mimics of no man's land remind us that in humanity's darkest hours, we don't just face external enemies. Sometimes we create threats that wear our own faces and speak with our own voices, carrying forward the consequences of our choices long after we've forgotten the decisions that shaped them.